Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
You pay your taxes, you have a career, maybe you even own a home.
Right.
You vote, you sign contracts, and, by all legal and biological definitions, you are an adult.
Yeah, on paper anyway.
Exactly. But what if, beneath the surface, your internal plumbing is completely unfinished? Like, what if society is just walking around full of people who look perfectly grown up on the outside, but inside, the walls haven't even been framed yet?
I mean, once you start looking at the world through this lens, you really cannot unsee it.
Oh, I bet.
We are so heavily conditioned to look at chronological age or, the accumulation of social milestones, graduating, getting a promotion, buying that house you mentioned, as definitive proof that someone is a fully formed adult.
Right, because that's what we've always been told.
Exactly.
Yep.
But when you examine the underlying structures that actually govern how a person processes reality, you realize that true psychological adulthood is remarkably rare.
So today we are cracking open Professor R.J. Starr's 2026 framework on psychological adulthood and psychological architecture. And our mission for this deep dive into the source material is to figure out why the calendar automatically says you are an adult, but your internal wiring might tell a completely different story.
To do that, we really have to establish the core premise of Starr's work, which is, it's a major departure from how we usually talk about growing up.
So.
We aren't talking about maturity as a moral virtue. We aren't talking about it as a personality trait, like just being a polite or responsible person.
Right, like paying your bills on time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We are talking about literal internal architecture. Starr identifies 4 specific internal domains: mind, emotion, identity, and meaning.
Okay.
And psychological adulthood is the specific condition where those 4 domains operate together as a fully integrated, coordinated system.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because internal architecture sounds a bit, abstract. When you say those 4 domains have to integrate, what actually happens if they don't?
When they don't integrate, when they remain fragmented, or worse, they actively compete with one another, the person remains in a state of what Starr calls psychological minority.
Wow, psychological minority.
Yeah. And that structural reality exists regardless of whether they are 25, 45, or, 85 years old.
So age literally has nothing to do with it.
Nothing at all.
Yeah.
The mind might be doing one thing, the emotion is reacting to something else entirely, and the identity is just desperately trying to hold it all together.
That sounds exhausting. So we're talking about millions of chronological adults walking around as psychological minors.
Essentially, yes.
And to understand how to actually build this internal architecture, we first have to look at why society just, assumes we already have it.
Right. The core distinction Starr draws here is between what is conferred and what is constructed.
Conferred versus constructed.
Yes. Chronological adulthood is conferred. It is simply handed to you by time and by law. The moment you hit 18 or 21, calendars and statutes magically recognize you as an adult.
You just wake up on your birthday and boom.
Exactly. You don't have to earn it. You just have to survive long enough to reach it.
It feels like chronological adulthood is basically like being handed the deed to an empty plot of land just because you turned 18.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like society hands you the piece of paper and says, congratulations, you're a homeowner.
Right.
But psychological adulthood is the grueling, incredibly unglamorous work of actually pouring the foundation, running the electrical wiring, and, building a house that won't collapse the second a storm hits.
That analogy holds up perfectly because psychological adulthood has to be deliberately constructed by the individual.
Right.
The real tragedy here is that our developmental environments, our schools, our universities, our early workplaces, they are totally unequipped to teach us how to build it.
Oh, for sure. They just teach us how to pass tests.
Exactly. They teach us how to perform cognitively. They teach us how to output the right answers, how to optimize a spreadsheet, how to comply with external rules.
But they rarely, if ever, teach us how to actually integrate our internal systems.
They don't. And so you end up with people who are incredibly high-functioning on paper, but completely hollow inside.
Wow, hollow inside.
Because they haven't built their own internal architecture. Because the mind, emotion, identity, and meaning domains aren't wired together, they have to rely entirely on external scaffolding to hold themselves up. What's fascinating here is how invisible this scaffolding can be until it's removed.
Meaning they borrow their structural integrity from the outside world.
Exactly. They borrow their meaning from whatever their company or their culture tells them is valuable. They rely on other people or maybe their romantic partners to regulate their emotions.
Right, outsourcing the hard work.
Yeah, they outsource their identity to their job title. You might look at a highly successful corporate executive who seems like the ultimate adult, right?
Sure, corner office, nice suit.
But if their entire sense of self completely collapses the moment they lose their title or face public criticism, they are structurally fragile. The scaffolding was holding them up, not their own internal foundation.
Okay, so if I'm looking at this empty plot of land, my internal plot of land, and I realize I need to actually build this house, where do I start? What are the first required phases of construction in Starr's framework?
The foundational step is resolving the fragmentation between the mind domain and the emotion domain.
Okay, so mine is like logic.
Yeah, perception, logic, cognitive processing. And in the default state of most individuals, these two systems, mind and emotion, do not talk to each other.
At all.
They operate in parallel. Or worse, they treat each other as enemies.
Wait, I always thought society had a pretty clear definition of someone who has their emotions under control. We look at someone who is stone-faced and totally stoic, someone who never cracks under pressure, and we think, wow, they really have it together.
Right, that's the cultural ideal.
But going through the research, Starr argues we are constantly confusing emotional suppression with emotional integration.
Yes, we celebrate suppression because it looks like efficiency to the outside world. But suppression is not cognitive dominance over emotion. It is a structural strategy of quarantining data.
Quarantining data.
You are taking vital information about how your body is experiencing the world and locking it in a vault.
It's like cutting the wire to your car's check engine light.
Oh, exactly.
The dashboard looks completely fine, so you think the car is perfectly fixed, but the engine is still quietly tearing itself apart under the hood. You haven't solved the problem at all. You've just destroyed the communication system.
The signal is still firing. The physical reality of the car hasn't changed just because you disabled the indicator. The emotional buildup is happening beneath the threshold of awareness.
And what happens when the vault gets too full?
When it finally degrades the system enough to express itself, maybe as a sudden severe burnout, a midlife crisis, or an explosive, uncharacteristic outburst, it arrives without any of the contextual processing that the mind could have provided if they had been communicating all along.
Oh, man. And then you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is total reactivity.
Right.
That's when the emotion bypasses the mind entirely, the check engine light comes on, and you immediately drive the car into a ditch in a panic.
Exactly. The action is usually fast, incredibly narrow, and totally out of proportion to whatever actually happened.
Yeah.
So true integration isn't about not feeling things.
Right.
It is about building a functional interface between feeling and thinking. It means your internal architecture can hold strong, uncomfortable feelings, examine the interpretive frames that generated those feelings, and then act from a coordinated position. You are receiving the emotional data without letting it hijack the steering wheel.
All right, so that's the foundation. The mind and the emotion are finally talking. But a foundation isn't enough to hold up a roof. You need load-bearing walls. And in the source material, the ultimate load-bearing structural element is this concept of radical accountability.
This is a huge piece of the framework.
Taking total ownership of your internal architecture, basically owning how you process, metabolize, and respond to things, even if you didn't cause the external event that triggered it.
And this is often the hardest phase of construction for people to accept. Radical accountability means recognizing that your internal world is your exclusive property and your exclusive responsibility.
I really have to push back here, though.
Go for it.
If someone experiences a genuine trauma or a massive systemic injustice, or even just gets fired unfairly, doesn't telling them to practice radical accountability sound dangerously close to victim blaming?
I completely understand why it sounds that way.
Like, are we seriously telling people they're responsible for the terrible things that happen to them?
No, not at all. And Starr's framework is very firm on this, and it is a vital distinction to make. It is absolutely not about taking blame for the harm.
Okay, so how does the framework handle that?
The framework explicitly acknowledges that harm is real, trauma is real, and it does not assign responsibility for the harm to the person who experienced it. Radical accountability is about recognizing that the interpretive frame, the ongoing emotional response, and the meaning assigned to the situation from that point forward are internally generated.
So the event is external, but the response is internal.
Exactly. The harm is not your fault. But if you organize your identity around that harm, you are falling into a structural trap.
A structural trap, meaning the injury literally becomes the load-bearing tiller of who you are.
Yes.
Let's say someone goes through a bitter, unfair divorce. If they organize their entire identity around the concept of, I am the victim of my ex-spouse, what happens to their internal house?
If your identity is built entirely around that grievance, then your identity will literally require the ongoing presence of that grievance to remain coherent.
Well,
think about the mechanics of that. If the injury is the core pillar holding up your sense of self, you cannot ever heal or release the bitterness without your entire internal house collapsing.
because it's literally holding up the roof.
Exactly. Your brain won't let you let it go.
Yeah.
Because letting it go means structural annihilation. It is an architectural limitation, not a moral failing.
Wow. So radical accountability simply means retaining interpretive authority over your own interior under all conditions.
That's beautifully put.
It's the ability to say, I didn't cause this event, but I completely own what I'm doing with this event today.
Yes.
Because without that load-bearing wall, your structure will always require favorable external conditions to stay standing.
And as we know, the external world rarely offers favorable conditions.
Which is the perfect pivot. Okay, so I've taken accountability. I've built this internal load-bearing wall.
Right.
But a wall isn't much good in a vacuum. What happens when it actually gets tested by the chaos of the real world? Because the modern world isn't exactly handing out calm, predictable weather.
No, definitely not.
It's basically a perpetual storm of chaos and ambiguity.
That brings us to the third capacity in the framework's structural tolerance.
Structural tolerance.
This is the ability of your internal architecture to handle genuine complexity and ambiguity without destabilizing. The real world is messy, filled with competing truths and situations where there were no clear good guys and bad guys.
And the most common failure here is what the framework calls binary collapse.
Yes, binary collapse.
Which is such a descriptive term. It's when someone takes incredibly complex, messy realities and just flattens them out into rigid black and white two-valued systems, us versus them, good versus evil, pure versus toxic.
What is crucial to understand is that binary collapse is not a failure of intelligence. Highly intelligent people do this all the time.
Really? So it's not about being smart?
Not at all. It is a structural defense mechanism. When a person's internal architecture simply cannot handle the sheer stress of two conflicting ideas being true at the same time, it panics and deletes one of them to reduce the load.
It's like trying to run the newest, most demanding 3D rendering software on a computer with 0 RAM.
Exactly.
The system overheats, panics, and just reboots in safe mode. You see this constantly in workplace conflicts or online debates. Let's say a manager gives critical feedback.
Okay.
A structurally sound person feels the sting, assesses the feedback, and adapts.
Right.
A person experiencing binary collapse feels the sting, their system overloads, and they immediately classify the manager as toxic and the workplace as unsafe.
Yes.
They delete the complexity that the manager might actually be right or just having a bad day to save their own internal structure from collapsing.
That rigid certainty isn't intellectual strength. It is just the architecture trying to keep itself within its operable range. The desperate demand for absolute certainty is actually a sign of profound structural weakness.
Because it's so brittle.
Exactly. It is the brittleness of a system that can only survive by excluding complexity. Which leads directly into the fourth capacity Starr outlines, which is autonomy. And the framework defines this very specifically as autonomy from the collective.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because most people, even chronological adults who pay their mortgages and raise kids, offshore their identity.
Yes, they do.
They use social mirrors, group validation, and cultural narratives to know who they are.
They outsource their structural locus of identity to the crowd. As long as the external signals from their peer group or their society are positive, they look robust.
But if the crowd turns on them,
The moment those signals were withdrawn or turn hostile, their identity destabilizes because the internal organization was never actually built. And this brings us face to face with the reality of the artificial era. We are living in an environment that is aggressively hostile to the development of psychological adulthood.
Because modern algorithmic platforms are explicitly optimized to capture our attention through the continuous delivery of social signals and reactive material, they literally feed on our lack of internal structure.
These systems structurally reward external orientation and actively punish internal differentiation.
How so?
Think about how a social media feed works. A person who relies on their own internal structures for identity generates far less engagement. They pause, they reflect, they don't immediately lash out.
Right. They aren't clicking and commenting furiously.
The algorithm doesn't want that. It wants the person who is constantly reacting to and constantly negotiating their position within a highly polarized social field.
It's an environment saturated with external mirrors, and it starves the very internal organization that psychological adulthood requires to grow.
Exactly.
Which completely changes how you look at the concept of empathy. I found this deeply profound in the research, the difference between true empathy and emotional contagion.
Yes, that's a huge distinction.
Because when your identity is outsourced to the collective, you are structurally vulnerable to whatever the collective is feeling on any given Tuesday.
Contagion happens when the individual architecture has no internal center of gravity to resist the pull of the social field. If your timeline is outraged, you're automatically outraged. If the group is terrified, you are terrified.
And we pat ourselves on the back and call that empathy. We say, look how deeply I care about the world. But empathy actually requires an internal structure that can register someone else's pain while maintaining its own distinct shape.
That's right.
Contagion is just a population that lacks internal regulation, catching the collective mood like a virus.
True autonomy means you can engage with the collective, participate in society, and receive social feedback without ever allowing the collective to become the primary structural pillar of yourself.
Okay, if this architectural deficit is everywhere, if millions of people are walking around structurally incomplete, why haven't traditional psychological tests caught it?
That's a great question.
I mean, looking at the academic paper, there are plenty of established psychological models out there that deal with maturity. You have Jane Livinger's ego development stages, Robert Kegan's orders of consciousness, the very famous Big Five personality traits. Why is Starr's framework saying something fundamentally different?
It comes down to the level of analysis. Those established models are brilliant, but they are measuring entirely different phenomena. Livinger and Kegan largely treat maturity as a developmental sequence.
Like climbing a ladder.
Right, a series of stages you progress through over time, mapping how you interact with rules or complex systems. And the Big Five tradition treats maturity as a constellation of personality traits, measuring your behavioral tendencies, like whether you score high on conscientiousness or agreeableness.
Right, but how does that practically differ from Starr's architectural model?
Think of it this way. Kegan's model is essentially measuring what floor of the building you've reached. Are you on the ground floor of self-interest or the penthouse of complex systems thinking?
Okay, I like that analogy.
And the Big Five is basically a detailed survey of how nicely the lobby is decorated. Are the couches agreeable? Is the lighting conscientious?
It's funny.
But Starr's framework operates entirely differently. It is the structural engineer crawling into the basement with a flashlight, checking to see if the steel beams are actually bolted together behind the drywall.
So you could literally ace a personality test, have a beautifully decorated lobby, be on the top floor of cognitive development, and still be an architectural house of cards.
Exactly. You could score exceptionally high on a self-report survey for emotional stability. But structurally, your identity might still be entirely dependent on external validation.
Wow.
You might be emotionally stable only because your current environment happens to be stable or because everyone around you is currently agreeing with you.
Right. The weather is just nice today.
Yeah. A self-report survey cannot detect if your mind and emotion domains are actually integrated or if you're just very good at cutting the check engine wire to maintain that high emotional stability score. The structural level operates completely beneath the behavioral and trait levels.
Wait, if Starr is right about this operating entirely beneath the surface, this feels terrifying on a macro level.
It definitely changes the picture.
If we have a society where the vast majority of chronological adults are actually psychological minors, what happens when we zoom out?
So what does this all mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? If I'm looking at our political systems right now, it feels like I'm watching millions of psychological minors fighting over the steering wheel. Is that what is actually driving our institutional fragility?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes. When you look at political polarization, the constant gridlock, and the complete loss of common ground in our culture, it is very easy to diagnose those as purely political or cultural issues.
Right. We blame the politicians. We blame the media ecosystems.
But Starr's framework argues that these crises are the aggregate macro-level results of a society composed of psychological minors.
Because when people lack structural tolerance, they literally cannot handle disagreement.
When an externally organized identity encounters political or cultural disagreement, it does not experience it as a debate over tax policy or zoning laws.
How do they experience it?
It experiences it as a literal physical threat to its own coherence. If my identity is completely propped up by my political tribe, then your disagreement isn't just an opposing thought. It is an attack on the scaffolding keeping me from collapsing.
The political becomes deeply personal as a structural fact.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we try to staff our democratic institutions with these exact people. But institutions like legislatures, courts, or even local school boards are fundamentally designed to function through deliberation, compromise, and navigating ambiguity.
Yes.
You have to be able to lose a vote and not feel like you've been personally annihilated.
But the participants can no longer handle ambiguity without experiencing binary collapse. So the institutions themselves become reactive, binary, and fragile.
Right.
They fail not because of a specific bad policy, but because the actual architectural capacity required to run a democracy is demographically vanishing.
And the tragedy is that a society organized this way just endlessly reproduces itself.
Absolutely.
The media systems financially reward reactivity. The political systems reward binary tribalism because it drives fundraising. The educational systems reward cognitive performance while entirely ignoring emotional architecture.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is a massive self-reinforcing loop that systematically prevents the development of the exact psychological adulthood the society so desperately needs to survive.
And it's worth noting that Starr deliberately does not offer a 10-step remedy or a quick-fix self-help guide at the end of this framework.
Which is frustrating but makes sense.
Structural changes of this magnitude do not happen through life hacks, app subscriptions, or simple policy shifts. They require rigorous, quiet, and often very painful internal labor.
It totally shifts how you view the world. You stop seeing a society of stubborn, difficult adults, and you start seeing a world of unfinished houses leaning on each other just to stay upright.
It's a sobering image.
It is. We've covered a lot today. Moving from conferred age to constructed architecture, integrating emotion without suppressing it, building that load-bearing wall of radical accountability.
Right, and learning to tolerate ambiguity.
Yes, and reclaiming autonomy from the algorithm. And it forces you to ask a pretty profound question.
What's that?
If our educational systems, our media landscapes, and our political arenas are all perfectly optimized to reward reactivity and binary thinking if the entire modern world essentially rewards us for remaining psychological minors, where in your own life can you carve out a safe, unmeasured space, a place away from the algorithms and the social mirrors, to actually do the quiet, costly work of laying your own foundation, running your own wiring, and finally finishing the plumbing on your adult mind?
That's the real challenge.
Something to think about.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.